Hilchos Tumas Tzaraas Perek Shlishi, the laws of impurity imparted by Tzaraas, chapter 3. We're in the discussion of Simane Tuma, the signs of impurity. What that means is, as we've already said multiple times, in order for a Tzaraas lesion to be qualifying and make you impure, two things have to happen. First of all, the nega, the spot itself, needs to be the correct shade and size. And then inside the spot, there has to be a sign of impurity. There are three signs of impurity. Either two white hairs, that was yesterday's discussion, spreading, the lesion spreads, that's tomorrow's discussion. Today, we're discussing the michya, healthy skin. If a patch of healthy skin appears inside the lesion, that makes the lesion impure. Today is all the laws related to this healthy skin. What are the conditions to make it impure? Many different varying cases of michyas appearing, reappearing, disappearing. That's going to be today's chapter. The Rambam begins with the basic conditions governing a michya. Number one, the size. Ein halacha aleph. Ein ha-michya siman tuma ad shetiyeh ka'adasha mirubas o yesed al zeh. Healthy skin is not considered a sign of impurity unless it's the size of a square lentil bean or more than that. The kama shiura, how much is a square lentil bean? Kedei tzmichas arba cyrus, the area where four hairs can grow. Shtayim oirach ushtayim reichav, two on the length and two on the width. In other words, the nega, the lesion itself, has to be a gris, 6 by 6 hairs. The michya has to be 1/9 of that, an area of 2 by 2 hairs. Number two, location. V'hu shatiya hamichya be'emtza habaheres. This is all provided that the healthy skin is smack in the middle of the lesion. V'habaheres makefes oisa mikol tzat. And the lesion needs to be surrounding it on all sides. There can be nothing interrupting, as we'll see in a moment. And v'hi yesera al hamichya reichav shtei sayres hayeser. It has to extend past the healthy skin, 2 hairs on each side. So in the case of a minimum lesion, the lesion is exactly 6 by 6 hairs, then the michya has to be smack in the middle. The commentary's point, when the Rambam says has to be be'emtza habaheres, that's talking about a minimum size lesion. Obviously, if it's a bigger white lesion, the healthy skin could be anywhere as long as there's 2 hairs on each side around the michya. But if the michya, in the case of a minimum lesion, was to the side of the lesion, so there aren't 2 hairs on each side, then it's not a sign of impurity, because it doesn't have the correct amount of hairs on the other side of it. What if it was scattered? That means it wasn't one entity of healthy skin. For example, you had healthy skin, mustard seed size in one place, another mustard seed size in another place. Even if all these little blotches were all in the middle of the baheres, so they take care of that criteria, there's 2 hairs on each side. The mini blotches don't combine to make the size of a lentil bean. Until there is in one place, and there was one entity, in the middle of the baheres, a square lentil size or more. Halacha base. Let's talk about the shade of the michya. Right, there are qualifying shades for lesions. What's the shade for a michya? It says that Rambam hamichya metama b'chol mara. Michyas create impurity in any shade. Bein shahaya mara hamichya adom, oy shachar, oy lavan. Whether the appearance of the michya is reddish, if it's black, or it's white. Doesn't matter the color, it makes it impure as long as it's healthy skin. Now, as the commentaries explain, there cannot be a mismatch. If a person has more of a whitish skin, a black michya is not a qualifying michya. The point that Rambam is saying is that whatever color or whatever shade your natural skin is, as long as the michya matches that shade, whether you're a ruddy person and the michya is red, or it's a black dark-skinned person and the michya is also black, or it's a white-skinned person and the michya is also white, the michya qualifies as a michya and it makes it impure. The who provided, in the case of the white skin, obviously the whiteness cannot be one of the qualifying shades for a lesion, because then it becomes a lesion, not healthy skin. A white-skinned, healthy skin has to be more darker than a qualifying white for a lesion. Halacha Gimel, another rule. We also had this rule when it came to the white hairs. Ein hamichya simin tuma ad shatiya begufa shel baheres. A healthy skin is not considered to be a sign of impurity unless it's occupying space on the actual lesion, not on anything else within the lesion, as the Rambam immediately clarifies. Ketzad, what does this mean? And there's a little error here in the text in the Muznaim Rambam. I'm going to read it as the proper texts have it. Baheres shahoya be'emtsa'a. You have a lesion, in the middle of the lesion, there are shchin, oy michva, oy michyasan, oy bayhak. Either a boil, that's the literal meaning of the word shchin, but it refers to a burn on the skin that came from something not fire-related. Michva is a term for a burn that comes from something fire-related. Oy michyasan means a healing area from a shchin or a michva. A boil or a burn that's healing. Oy bayak is regular pigmentation. So one of these four abnormal skin features are inside of the baheres. V'hamichya b'seich hashchin, oy b'seich hamichva, oy b'seich michyasan, oy b'seich habayak. And the healthy skin is inside them, kind of lying on top of them. On top of the boil, on top of the burn, on top of the healing area of boil or burn or the pigmentation. Afal pisha michya be'emtza baheres, even though the michya, in relationship to the white lesion, happens to be in the middle of the white lesion. So it meets that criteria. But since it's not begufa shel baheres, since it isn't on the body of the lesion, eina siman tuma. It's not a sign of impurity. Mipnei shehi b'seich hashchin, oy hamichva, oy b'seich habayak, oy michyasan, because it's inside the boil, or the burn, or the pigmentation, or their healing area. So that's not a good michya because it's not begufa shel baheres. V'chein, and similarly, this case looks very similar, but there's a little nuance that makes it different. Im hikif hashchin oy michyasai, v'hamichva oy michyasa, v'habayak es hamichya. Some texts have hashchin es michyasa, hamichva es michyasa, but the proper reading is oy. You have a boil or its healing area, a burn or its healing area, or a pigmentation are surrounding the michya. That means that while in the first case, the michya was kind of resting on top of them, here the michya is also in the middle of them. It's surrounded by these abnormal skin features. Or one of them became adjacent to the michya. So the michya is in the middle of the lesion, but it's not surrounded by lesion on all sides, because on one of the sides, it's attached to one of these abnormal boils or burns. Or one of these abnormal skin features split a michya in half, entered inside it. So, in a way, this side of the michya is not surrounded fully by lesion, and this side of the michya is also not surrounded fully by lesion. Eina siman tuma. So in all these cases, the michya is not a sign of impurity. It's simply treated like a lesion that has no sign of impurity, v'yasgir. And you put it into quarantine, as you would for any lesion that appears without a sign of impurity. But if this boil or burn or pigmentation disappeared, the one that was under the michya in the first case, or the ones that were to its side in the third case, or they were surrounding it as in the second case, or they were entering it as in the fourth case, and now you have just the michya sitting alone inside the actual lesion, after 1 or 2 weeks of quarantine, then he's decidedly impure, because now you have a lesion with a sign of impurity inside of it. If they don't move after 2 weeks, you simply go home, because there's no more than 2 weeks quarantine when it comes to skin lesions. Of course, if later they reappear, if they disappear and now the michya is left alone, you'll become impure. But for now, after 2 weeks, we're going to send you home. Halacha dalid. Unlike when it comes to white hairs, that the white hairs have to appear after the lesion comes, and then the lesion has to turn the hairs white. Hamichya siman tuma la'ilam. When it comes to the healthy skin is always a sign of impurity. Bein shekadma michya as habaheres, bein shekadma baheres as hamichya. Whether the healthy skin came before the lesion, or the lesion came before the healthy skin. Now, how do you have a healthy skin coming before the lesion? I mean, logically, it would seem that the lesion comes and healthy skin appears inside of it. So the commentaries say we're talking about such a case. The lesion to begin with came in this shape. It's centered around an area of healthy skin. Point is, in either case, the michya is a sign of impurity. Because it doesn't say the words, it transformed. When it comes to the white hairs, it says, V'hi hafcha se'er lavan. The lesion transformed the hairs into white. But by michya, it just says there is healthy skin, whether it was turned by the lesion or not. Talking about that, says the Rambam, let's examine a puzzling verse in the Torah. As we saw yesterday, at the end of the chapter when we quoted the actual verses, it wasn't part of the chapter, but I did it as an extra credit. I actually hinted to what the Rambam is about to say right now, but I'll let the Rambam enunciate it himself. In the verse about the michya, the only time the terminology michya appears is next to white hairs. There's never a verse that says there was a lesion with healthy skin in it. It says there's a lesion with white hairs and healthy skin in it, which makes it sound like healthy skin on its own is not a proper sign of impurity. So the Rambam clarifies. The fact that the Torah says that it transformed into white hairs, and there's a sign of healthy skin inside the lesion. There's not a need. Torah is not saying that it's necessary to have both signs of impurity in order to make it impure. Hair and healthy skin. Each one alone is a sign of impurity. The only reason Torah puts them together, white hairs with the healthy skin, is to tell us the size of healthy skin. In the beginning of the chapter, we said what? 2 by 2 hairs. Where did that size come from? It comes from here. The healthy skin has to be big enough to hold the size of what's called white hairs. In the Torah, white hairs means shuhu shtei sidus, 2 hairs. Hence, the healthy skin has to be at least an area of 2 by 2 hairs. But the sign alone of healthy skin is enough to impurify a lesion. Halacha hey. Let's go back to the case of a classic lesion. Vaheres kigris mitzumtzam. You have a lesion that's exactly the proper size, 6 by 6 hairs. Ube'emtza michya ka'adasha mitzumtzemes. And in the middle there's a healthy skin, also exactly the right size. 2 by 2 hairs. Hareza muchlat. So obviously, that's decidedly impure. The person is tameh. Nisma toha baheres. But if the lesion on the outside gets smaller, watch this, boom, the white area got smaller. Oy shenisma toha michya. Or the white lesion stayed the same, but the healthy skin became smaller. Tahar, in both of these scenarios, the lesion is now pure. Some texts don't have the word tahar. They wait for the end of the sentence to say tahar. But the law is the same. In this case, where the lesion decreased or the michya decreased, the whole thing is pure. Now, there's a little bit of a problem, because even if the healthy skin went away, look, granted in the case of a smaller lesion, it's a smaller lesion. It doesn't have the right size, so it's totally pure. But in this case, if all we have is the michya going down, why should the lesion become totally pure? It should be quarantined. Now you have a lesion with no sign of impurity, put it into quarantine. So here the commentaries tell us a very important rule. And that is, and that Rambam himself mentions it tomorrow, that a lesion that began with a sign of impurity and therefore was assigned to be impure, once it loses that sign of impurity, it never goes back to quarantine. It goes back just to being totally pure. Special law. Once you have din tuma, once you have a level of impurity, you don't go back to quarantine. And therefore, in this case, where the healthy skin became less, it's totally pure. V'chein, so too, back to the case. You had a minimum size lesion, minimum size michya. Im rav saha michya shebeseich baherezu, if the michya's size increased inside of the baheres, looks like an increase, right? It's a decrease for the laws. Tahar, you're actually pure. She'ena baheres mitama b'michya, because the lesion cannot become impure through the healthy skin, unless it extends past the michya 2 hairs on each side. In this scenario, you have a minimum size lesion. So once the michya is too big, there aren't 2 hairs on each side, so the whole thing is actually pure. Let's consider this case. You began with a minimum size lesion, but a too small healthy skin. The healthy skin was less than a lentil size. And then the michya increased to become the proper size. Of course, you are decidedly impure. But now, what happens if the michya now decreases from its size? And the commentaries explain it means it goes back to its original size. It goes back to being that small size. Or it completely disappeared. First point, the lesion remains as it was and requires quarantine, even though I just mentioned before that once a lesion has a sign of impurity, it never goes back to being quarantined. Here it does, because that rule only applies if the lesion begins with impurity. Here it began with too small, then it increased, and now it decreased. So we could put it back into quarantine. An additional point that the Rambam makes is the ein kan siman tuma. There's no sign of impurity. Meaning what, as the commentaries explain, seemingly, if the michya got bigger and then it got smaller, didn't the lesion just spread? one of the signs of impurity is spreading. If the healthy skin decreased, then the lesion just spread. So why isn't it impure? That's not a siman tuma, says the Rambam, because as we learn tomorrow, spreading inwards is not called spreading. The halachic spreading, which we talk about, is spreading outwards, not spreading inwards. Halacha vav, what if we have this scenario? Actually, a pretty easy scenario to comprehend. Baheres yesera mikigris, uba michya yesera mikadasha. Massive lesion, massive healthy skin. The lesion is bigger than a gris, the healthy skin is bigger than an adasha, v'ravu eshen yismatu. Then it doesn't matter. They can get bigger and smaller, no difference. Tameh, the person still remains impure, because he began with an impure lesion, so it just continues being in that status. Ubilvad, of course, provided shalo yismayit baheres mikigris, v'lei tismayit hamichya mikadasha. Number one, the lesion itself cannot become smaller than 6 by 6 hairs. Number two, the healthy skin cannot become smaller than the 2 by 2 hairs. And also, make sure that the healthy skin doesn't get too close to the edge of the lesion, with the area less than 2 hairs growth, as we explained. Because once you don't have that, the whole michya is not a sign of impurity anymore, as we've seen already a couple of times. Halacha zayin, let us consider this scenario. A little more complex. 2 lesions at a time. Baheres kigris. We begin on the inside with a lesion the proper size, 6 by 6 hairs. A little bit inaccurate. See, it's only 4 by 6. Imagine it's 6 by 6. Okay, it's a proper gris. Ubasar chai ka'adasha o yeser makifa mibachutz. Healthy skin, meeting the proper lentil size, is surrounding it from the outside. Now, of course, that's not a problem for the inner lesion, because the inner lesion doesn't have anything inside of it. But there's healthy skin outside of it. And now there's a second lesion surrounding the healthy skin. So pay attention. The outer lesion does have a sign of impurity in it, healthy skin. The inner lesion does not. So what is the law? So first of all, the inner lesion is going to be quarantined. Because there's no sign of impurity, but it might develop one, so we've got to put it away for a week. But the outer one is decidedly impure. Because there's a healthy skin inside of it, which is a sign of impurity. But what happens? What happens if the size of the healthy skin between the 2 lesions becomes decreased? Or it disappears. So now says the Rambam, whether it was decreasing from the inside, meaning because the inner lesion expanded, as we see over here. Boom. The inner lesion expanded. Or or it was decreasing from the outside. So let's go back to the case. Here's the healthy skin, and now it decreases from the outside because the outer lesion ate up into it. In both of these cases, they're both considered to be like one big lesion that has no sign of impurity. And what do you do with it? So even though the Rambam makes it sound like they become one big baheres, and they all have to be quarantined, as the commentaries note, it's not true. Only the inner lesion now has to be quarantined. The outer lesion is actually pure, because the outer lesion began with a sign of impurity. And I've already told you, once a baheres begins with a sign of impurity, if it loses that sign, it never goes back to quarantine and only goes back to being pure. Now, one thing has to be addressed in this case, the first case, where you have the healthy skin and then it decreases from the inside. Seemingly, the inner lesion just spread, and there's a problem of pisyon, a problem of spreading. Why isn't this lesion being sent decidedly to be impure? So the commentaries explain, because even though it's spreading outwards, but it's not spreading outwards into healthy skin. It's spreading outwards into a lesion, because this healthy skin is actually just a sign of impurity on the outer lesion. So it's spreading forward, not into regular skin, but into irregular skin. Spreading into irregular skin doesn't qualify as spreading. Halacha ches. I got to be honest, these last 2 halachas are quite difficult. Not because they don't read well. Halacha ches reads very easily. But then once you learn halacha tes, it makes ches totally not understandable. The commentaries struggle with it at length. I'm going to offer you one approach from the Chazon Ish, how he resolves these 2 halachas, and that's how we'll leave it. Any online viewership that has other interpretations, please, I'd love to know about it. Put it in the comments. First, let's do halacha ches. Ches, it's pretty straightforward. Baheres shahoisa b'roish ever min ha'evarim. if you have a white spot, a lesion develops on the tip of one of your limbs. The Rambam will soon give us a list. There are certain areas in the body that are called Rashei Evarim, tips of limbs. And so imagine you have, let's say, a finger, okay? So you have the tip of the finger, becomes fully enclosed with a white spot. V'hamichya be'emtza habaheres b'reisha ever. And then there's a healthy skin in middle of the baheres, but it's directly at the tip of the limb. So if around the finger was a white spot, now in the middle you have an area, 2 by 2 hairs, that's now having healthy skin. So it would seem to be a baheres with a michya inside of it. This should be impure. Says the Rambam, no, eina siman tuma. This is not a sign of impurity. Why not? Naturally speaking, when you have this tapering tzaraas, the healthy skin makes it look divided. You can't see it all at once. Part of it is descending, tapering on one side of the finger. Part of it is tapering on the other side of the finger. What's the problem with that? It says by tzaraas, a special law, the Kohen has to see it. He has to be able to observe the entirety of the spot at once. Either that's learned from the extra vav, v'ra'ahu hakayin, he sees it, or the whole 2 words are extra, because Torah begins with the word v'ra'ah hakayin over here. So why say v'ra'ahu hakayin again? Special words to teach us that he has to be able to see the entirety of the spot. When you're looking down at the tip of a finger, you don't see the whole thing at once, especially because the healthy skin in the middle confuses the eye, and you can't see the whole thing together. Talking about tips of limbs, what's the list of those tips? The following are the tips of limbs that do not transmit impurity through a healthy spot. First of all 10 fingers and all 10 toes. The tips of the ears. The tip of the nose. The tip of the male organ. And the nipples of women's breasts. But the nipples of a man's breast, they don't extend as much. And a wart, or a roundish extension of flesh on a person's body, v'hadildulin, or hanging flesh, those don't qualify as Rashei Evarim, mitamin b'michya, they do transmit impurity if there's a lesion on top of them, and there's healthy skin inside them, that is considered to be impure. So, pretty straightforward. Rashei Evarim don't have the law of michya. But now, halacha tes confuses the whole thing. It says the Rambam, v'chol Rashei Evarim elu, shahaya mikayman yeshiv kigris. If any of the tips of these limbs had an area on their surface of not just 2 by 2 hairs, 6 by 6 hairs, a full lesion could develop on them. Maybe the person is fat. His fingers are very chubby. On the top of the finger, there's an area of 6 by 6 hairs. So then, mitamin bin negayim, the laws of tzaraas apply to that area. If a lesion develops there with the proper signs, it becomes impure. But if they're rounded and tapered, like most people's fingers are, then they're actually pure. The whole law of lesions doesn't even apply. A lesion can't develop there. That will create a problem. What does that mean? Ketzad? Baheres kigris, if a person develops a spot the size of a gris, 6 by 6 hairs, bereish chatmoy, bereish etzboy, on the tip of the nose, or the tip of a finger, shefas, elach, ve'elach, tapering off to each side. Tahar. The whole thing is pure. The whole lesion is a non-lesion. Shenemar, because it says, same verse, v'ra'ahu hakayin, the kohen needs to see it, ad shireu kulei ka'achas, till you see it all at once. Since you can't see the whole white spot all at once, so it's not considered a white spot, no problem. So now, you're learning this, you have to ask the obvious question. If the whole lesion is a non-lesion on the tip of a finger, so why spend the whole halacha telling us about a healthy spot in a white spot? The whole white spot is nothing. If you make a big deal out of the healthy spot, that means you're implying that the white spot is something to be reckoned with. But if the Rambam says over here that the whole white spot is a non-spot, so who cares about the michya? So all the commentaries ask this question. The Ravid suggests, very interesting answer, that the Rambam is actually alluding to a law we're going to learn later. Later on we're going to see that if a person has an impure lesion on his body, and then it spreads to his entire body, the whole body becomes covered with tzaraas, so counterintuitively, you become pure. Torah says, from an impure lesion, it covers the entire body, now it's pure. Now, in order to be covering the entire body, it must cover literally the entire body. And the halacha makes the point to mention these Rashei Evarim, these tips of limbs. That if the tip of a finger has a healthy spot, it's ma'akev. That means it withholds the spreading from being called a halachically significant spreading, and the person still remains impure. So the Ravid says, That's what the Rambam is teaching us. When it comes to the laws of spreading, that healthy spot counts for something. It's essential. But over here, in the basic laws of Tzaraas, if a lesion develops there, then it doesn't count for anything. That answer is according to the Rabbi himself, but it doesn't take into account the Rambam's premise that the whole lesion on the tip of a finger is not a lesion. So the one answer that I'll share with you today is from the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish says, and he has a nuance in the Rambam that proves it, that actually in Halacha Tes, the Rambam is telling us the real law. A lesion on the tip of the finger is a non-lesion. In Halacha Ches, the Rambam is referring to a very specific case. Not a case of a lesion developing on the tip of a finger, but rather, he says, the lesion developed elsewhere on the finger. So the lesion is over here, in a proper place, 6 by 6 hair's breadths. And then a strand of the lesion spread to the tip of the finger. Now we'll see tomorrow that when a lesion spreads with just by a strand, sometimes what happens to the strand could affect the whole lesion. So the Rambam is telling us that if the strand goes to the top of the finger, and now in this extended part of the lesion, a healthy spot develops, so the lesion itself is good, because the main lesion is down here. But maybe the healthy spot over here will influence that lesion and make it into an impure lesion. That's what the Rambam says, a special law. The healthy spot divides the lesion from being seen all at once, because it's partially here, partially there, partially behind the healthy spot. You can't see it together, and therefore, it's not considered a sign of impurity, and the lesion over here will remain pure.